This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
If you're an employee, the company does have the right to ask you for a medical certificate. I think we forget what medical certificates were originally there for, because sick leave is paid leave. You're still getting paid when you're on medical leave. So a medical cert is just that you're getting a note from the doctor to say, yes, he or she is too sick to go to work. Please tell your company, right? So it's fine. So you still get paid because the doctor has signed you off. So it's very easy. We forget this. We just see it as some sort of admin thing that we have to do. But it's there actually for a reason. It's supposed to be a control to help people show that, yes, I should get paid today.
The ability to take leave from work for medical and personal reasons are a cornerstone of jobs today. Yet, tensions can still arise. It might not always be clear when an employer has good benefits policies and when an employer is actually being overbearing in terms of what it requires of its workers. And this topic is something that we will address in today's podcast conversation. Hello, I am Tae Hong Yi. You are listening to Headstart On Record, the show that gives a head start to your personal finance and career. Our guest today is an expert on how to design benefits, including healthcare, insurance, flexible benefits, and processes within an advisory organization. He's Mr. Richard Cooper, business leader for benefits for Mercer Marsh Benefits in Singapore. Welcome to the show, Richard.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here.
So let's just get straight into it, Richard. You work with organizations to design their benefits structures. How do you do so, and what does your job look like?
Okay, it's a good question. Our principal stakeholders are HR within corporates. Their main role, of course, is to attract, retain, and grow talent, but also to be there in the moments of need of their employees. Our role is to work very closely with HR to help them design those kind of benefit plans, to help them get the best balance between their business outcomes, which could be based on their budget or what they're trying to achieve as an organization, but also to make sure that employees have a clear plan for when those moments of need come. So maybe some serious critical illness is a good example of that. So our role is to get the best alignment between those business objectives and what the employees are really needing.
So on the point of alignment, right? So I imagine sometimes there can be some sources of misunderstanding or tension between employers and employees, especially when it comes to issues of medical leave. And how do you then work with organizations to then find common ground between all these competing considerations?
I think that any kind of topic like this is always some kind of trade-off. I mean, it goes fundamentally to the fact that we work, right? And you're an employee of an organization. And most of these go back to the culture of that organization and what is important to that organization in terms of what it wants to do with its business, but also how it manages and treats and encourages its employees. And we can talk about best practices, for example, but the best practices really start with a very good understanding of culture, and then policies and practices and guidelines all come from there. Companies deciding what is important or not important for them based on their objectives, but also their workforce, whether it be blue collar or white collar. That mix of employees and the kind of work they do is actually very critical to understanding some of these topics and challenges.
So that's great to hear, because something that we often receive queries from readers seeking help, right, in our coverage of manpower and labor issues is policies surrounding medical certificates or MCs, and what can corporates do and what shouldn't corporates do and what's appropriate for corporates to do, and also on the part of the employee, what dictates what is appropriate for them in terms of taking an MC. So maybe starting with employers, what are some of the best practices that employers should adopt and someone should be able to see to suss out good employers?
Benefits is a very interesting space because a lot of people make their decision around their chosen employer based on compensation. But what you realize very quickly is compensation, of course, is important because people have bills to pay. But people get very used to the benefits of an organization quickly. So that could be very good benefits, so people feel very happy working there, or very limited benefits, which then become a bit of a challenge and can be a push factor or a pull factor when people decide to change employer. So best practice is really two main areas: the kind of leave there is, which could be your annual leave, hospitalization leave. Even we have things like voluntary leave. So basically it's for volunteering work, so volunteer leave, so we can support the community. So best practice could also mean things above the statutory minimum. So a lot of the leave, like sick leave or hospitalization leave or annual leave, yes, it is governed by the Employment Act, but many organizations do more than that. And that is something that people need to consider. Am I getting the bare minimum, or is my organization really looking at the kind of work I'm doing and making sure I have adequate leave and adequate support, either because I have leave I want to take or that something is happening in my life that I need to address. So that's your sick leave or hospitalization leave, or that we care about the community. So I'm giving people 2 days a year or something to give back to the community. Also, there's another part to this, which is interesting because best practice also is about transparency and communication. There is no point having a leave policy that nobody understands or nobody knows where to find it. It also has to be consistently applied. It has to be fair. It cannot be that you get 5 days, I get 3, or you can take paid sabbatical, I cannot. So it's those kind of things that also make a big difference as well in terms of best practice, that not only is it clearly communicated and there's transparency, but it's applied fairly. It's not favoritism and things like that. I also think increasingly we're seeing that wellness is a very critical component to this, because a lot of these factors circle around stress. So stress in the workplace, which of course post-COVID has increased a fair bit. So organizations tend to be bringing that kind of factor in, recognizing that actually most medical costs are borne by organizations. So what can they do as a organization, A, to support their employees, but also in some ways manage their cost as well, to get their claims under control. So that's what best practice looks like.
No, that's a very comprehensive overview. It helped me, and I certainly think it helps our listeners as well. And in that case, how can employers effectively design processes to curb the abuse of MCs and balancing against not being too excessive or controlling in that regard?
I think, we touched on this area as well. A lot of this is about trust. I think sometimes over-amplified. Singapore is a small place and sometimes things are over-amplified. Actually, Singapore on the whole is a very compliant society, and even in the workplace. So abuse doesn't happen very often, but we all know that a small number of people can spoil the market for a broader. This is a phenomenon around the world, but particularly here. So a lot of this, I think, again, putting these things into context, it is very important to bear in mind that we can talk about controls or we can talk about risk, but most importantly, it doesn't happen very often, right? And there may be a couple of circumstances where people do that. One is because they really have run out of leave and want to take it, or that they're in an organization that then don't feel supported by, that those things I talked about as best practice aren't potentially there, so they can't have a proper dialogue about leave that they need to take, or that the policy is not transparent, or as we talked about, there's no proper tracking, so they think they can do these things and then they find out that they shouldn't be doing it. But the bad actors, the number of people that actually deliberately go on holiday when they're supposed to be taking medical leave is actually very, very small. So again, it's clear policies, verifying medical certificates. So if you're an employee, the company does have the right to ask you for a medical certificate. I think we forget what medical certificates were originally there for, because sick leave is paid leave. You're still getting paid when you're on medical leave. So a medical cert is just that you're getting a note from the doctor to say, yes, he or she is too sick to go to work. Please tell your company, right? So it's fine. So you still get paid because the doctor has signed you off. So it's very easy. We forget this. We just see it as some sort of admin thing that we have to do. But it's there actually for a reason. It's supposed to be a control to help people show that, yes, I should get paid today.
And so on that point about control, right?
Yeah.
How can someone, and this comes to this wider point about kind of guiding employees, kind of practical tips for workers. What are some kinds of approaches you've seen taken by employers that workers should consider to be potentially kind of overreaching? Because I think that boundary can get a bit blurred sometimes. We can just talk about it in the general sense, yeah.
I mean, overreaching, as I said, the company has the right to know. I mean, the issue is trust is a very critical piece because you've got layers here. You've got the employee, you've got the manager, then you've got the company. So the company itself, the culture that you work in, is it a culture of trust? Is it, I trust my guys to do the right thing? The manager of that person actually needs to know what's going on. So it should be that you as an employee are telling your manager, I don't feel very well today. Actually, most of the time, the manager will just accept it. It's only in those circumstances where, yes, you say I'm sick, and then 2 hours later on Facebook, he sees you in the beach club in Sentosa, right? I mean, these are the sort of situations that do happen, but again, happen rarely. And the manager needs to know because he's the one or she's the one actually approving your leave. And people need to know that they need to go to the doctor, get a medical certificate and submit it. So those controls are pretty clear. But actually, most of the time in an organization where you trust, increasingly people don't need a medical certificate on the first day, potentially even not on the second day sometimes, because actually there's a cost to going to the doctor. So it's a bit unnecessary. If you've got a 24-hour flu, not feeling so good, just stay at home. Actually, people can work from home, or if you trust your team, let them work from home and come back when they're ready. But I think it also goes back to the kind of organization that you work for. And again, that level of trust that people have, but also you as an individual, what kind of responsibility you have. Because that's great when everybody plays their part. It's only when your manager is overbearing and starts coming around your house, or the company starts putting very draconian rules in. But again, for a small number of people, then of course, there will always be blowback in those cases.
And this speaks to the issue of proportionality as well. That the idea that, yes, controls are needed, but then how widely and how draconian the controls are relative to the risk and relative to the loss. I think that seems to be a need for a sense of proportionality. And I think that seems to be the guiding principle on both sides, really, that they have to adopt.
And I think that, there are examples in Singapore, clearly, where companies may have overstepped the mark of what seems to be reasonable. There is clearly a business reason for that. It could be very sensitive work. It could
frontline roles even.
Yeah, frontline roles, exactly. And very sensitive frontline roles sometimes. And there's obligations that they have to put people there, and probably contracts they have to make sure those roles are manned. So it's very hard to plan those kind of roles, particularly when it comes to resourcing, if they have no idea whether somebody's going to be absent or not. But then find out, even though they're absent and have made some sort of arrangement to put somebody there, that they find out that that person's not actually sick. So it does really go back to the nature of work, the role that that person is doing, and also the responsibility that person has. Those roles are actually very, very sensitive roles.
So then in that case, should workers be expected to plan their leave periods, especially medical leave, but also other kinds of leave, based on company timelines or the likely workload?
I think that's a yes, but also no. If it's something like sick leave, you don't plan to be sick. I think, and we're talking earlier, for example, about getting a cold or getting diarrhea, stomach flu kind of things. People don't plan those things. So it's very hard to do that at a convenient time. Of course, people need to look after themselves, which is why you see increasing wellness programs, because in some ways, organizations feel responsible to educate their workforce how to look after themselves, because they want happy, healthy, productive employees. One thing which is quite interesting is when it comes to annual leave, yes, there should be some kind of planning around that, because some work is very seasonal. There should also be some handover to people. So there is a responsibility of organizations to have enough staff, have enough capacity in an organization that you can hand over to somebody. Because leave should mean leave, right? If you're going away for 2 weeks, it's not leave if you're constantly connected, checking on work. So there is a balance there, again, between people's own desire to be wanted, own desire to be a very critical piece of that organization, and their need to disconnect. A lot of stress is related to the fact that we're constantly online, we're constantly feeling that urge to be productive and then not getting a break. That's actually what annual leave is supposed to be for. You disconnect, go and do something else, come back to the workplace feeling refreshed and ready for the rest of the year. But sick leave is also quite different, I think. And I think there's definitely a need on annual leave side to explain to your boss and to choose carefully. But it's your leave, right? It's a regulated requirement that you take it. So you're quite within your rights to take it, but you also work for an organization with colleagues who you should care about, a company that you care about, and a boss that you care about. So you should do the right thing by them too. Yes.
So Richard, we're just talking about leadership shadows. So perhaps could you share with us what does that mean and how does it apply to this context?
Yeah, because we talk about organizations being supportive, and that's very important. And the culture within that organization where people walk the talk, where you have clear policies and communication, transparency and accountability and those kind of things. But yes, you still get managers who may be a bit overbearing sometimes. A lot of that can be linked to their own objectives or deadlines, again, which is why communication and prioritization is important, because medical leave may happen at any time, or annual leave, and that may be a bit inconvenient. So it's only, again, in an environment where people can talk it through, people meet in the middle is very important. So I think if we're talking about the importance of leave, that it is very important that people get a break. It is very important that people are able to disconnect from their organizations. But we're in organizations, we get paid. So it's really trying to find that happy medium, but also knowing that it's a statutory requirement that people take leave.
And just on that point about the balance of it, so should we be expecting employers to have excess manpower in reserve? And I imagine there's some sort of tension there against this kind of wider push towards a leaner workforce that organizations talk about, everyone talks about it.
I mean, it's the reality, right? And you can see a couple of things post-COVID. It maybe people feel it more than most because, a business's purpose is to generate profit. So how organizations manage capacity, productivity, work maybe being offshored to shared service centers in Malaysia or India or the Philippines. I mean, people are really feeling that in the workplace, which is where some of this stress factor is really coming from. But again, if an organization has the right culture where leave is leave and people can take leave, whether it be annual leave or medical leave when they're supposed to, it may not only be an issue of capacity. I mean, it is great that you have your covering officer or whatever you want to call it, where when you're taking leave, you hand over your 5 activities to your colleagues. And that's what a supportive culture means, that you're in a team with people who, when you go on leave, they cover for you. And when they go on leave, you cover for them. But very much it goes back to the kind of work that people do. So maybe that's hard sometimes because, if I'm doing something very specialized, then maybe it's difficult to hand over. But there's a couple of things there that are very important. One is building that sort of key man risk where only certain things are done by certain people. And that's actually not healthy for the person or the organization in the long run. And the other factor, I think, which is also not good is just people don't prioritize because priority is really important. So if you're not around for 2 weeks and then everything stops, actually that's not healthy for a business. So it's very important that people have that empathy to the employee, but the employee also has empathy to the fact that business has to continue. So they need to work with a manager or an appropriate person in their organization to prioritize tasks, to try and get some things done before they go. And then they've got a 2-week home run to sit on the beach or whatever they need to do to disconnect.
So then how do we create an environment where people don't feel like they are burdening colleagues when they, for example, go on MC?
I think there's a couple of things in there. One is normalizing and supporting leave taking. And that also goes back to the leadership shadow, that if your boss is constantly replying to messages when you're on leave, that the shadow tends to mean that their staff do it too. So actually normalizing leave taking is actually a very critical component to that. Also, fair and transparent workload distribution. So it's not like 1 or 2 people do all the work and then the rest sit and wait. How you transfer work between people is actually very important. So it doesn't matter whether you're talking about manufacturing or servicing, how you balance work between people, and particularly when somebody has to go away, is a very key component to that as well. But there is some kind of obligation inside organizations to make sure you have enough people to do the work. because when you don't, work stops. So organizations need to think about productivity, capacity, but also not only from a profit perspective, but from a work design perspective as well.
And there's an actuarial perspective even, right? Like or rather companies kind of have to design for a certain buffer to a degree.
I think increasingly that buffer has shrunk, to be very honest, in many organizations, particularly multinational organizations. So that buffer is shrinking. But the way to deal with that is prioritization, really deciding what is important and not important, and then customizing the work accordingly, because people only have so many hours in the day. So you can't handle 20 different items if you only have enough people to do 10 of them. So that is, again, about work design, maybe new technologies coming in to automate things, AI also automating things so you can get more from the same. But that is also the obligation of organizations to design their work correctly.
So as I was consulting widely on how to frame this episode, one other point that came up to me was about longer-term leave, especially one key example being maternity leave. So there's a bit of that complexity there in that, there's some capacity for planning, but then there's balance against the self-actualization and how much planning you can really do and how much planning can you really do for the sake of your organization for something that's so intimately personal and self-actualizing.
I mean, maternity leave is very important. I mean, the birth rate in Singapore is particularly low. So this is a challenge, right? I mean, as a country, Singapore has one of the highest aging populations and one of the fastest aging populations in the world. So the replacement rate is not so good. I can't remember. I think it's now under 1. So that's not great. Secondly is the population is aging. So we should be being very thankful, very excited when people take maternity leave. It's fantastic. And the more they take, the better. But again, there is that challenge of Singapore is also a very work-orientated culture as well. So yes, when you think about maybe Australia or you compare Singapore to Australia in terms of maternity leave, paternity leave, actually many of those kind of economies are much more favorable to maternity leave than Singapore is. Although Singapore in 2025 in April and also in 2026, there are some adjustments to paternity leave. So Singapore is getting more generous to statutory maternity leave and paternity leave than it has done in the past. So that's going from 4 weeks to 10 weeks, for example. So that's great. But you can't necessarily plan maternity leave. But what is important, if somebody drops for a few months, the organization, again, has to prioritize. Do I need to bring temporary staff in? Can I move somebody from another team to cover? Or can I just rearrange the work so that, I need to keep that space for that person to come back because they were an important team member and they will always be an important team member. And they're even more important to society that they've now had a child and helped with the replacement rate. So we've got to welcome them back, but we've got to cover the work when they've gone. So it's not necessarily creating vast excess capacity, but it's just being a bit flexible about how work is done.
So how do economies who are much further along this journey in terms of maternity and paternity leave, how do they pull it off? Like places like Australia and not to mention the Nordics.
I think it's in some ways different priorities. And you can see the Nordic countries being a very classic example of very family-friendly, in some ways socialistic kind of tendencies. And that is, I think, very specific to Scandinavian countries. I think Singapore has a very solid work ethic, and that's mainly because of the way that things are set up here, particularly from an employee perspective. It is a very employer-friendly environment. So it creates certain things. And you also have to remember many people here have helpers. In Nordic countries, they do not. Australia, they do not. So it is more common there that people do work very clear 9 to 5 hours, sometimes 7 till 2, because they've got to go home, they've got to pick up their kids, they've got to cook dinner, because if they're not cooking dinner, the kids are going to starve, right? Nobody else is going to cook it for them. So different countries, different societies have evolved slightly differently and have different priorities. So we shouldn't forget those other people in our society that enable some of these kind of practices to sort of happen. But certainly, I think encouraging people to have more children and maternity policies, paternity policies, to encourage that time of parents to bond with their children, to be there in those very difficult few months, because quite frankly, nobody's getting any sleep then, how productive people really are is always questionable, but people have to work. People have to earn money. People have to pay their mortgage, right? So organizations need to support that. I mean, you see the population is aging. We're going to have an increasing number of sort of older people in the workforce, which is a very interesting topic in itself. Work will change, right? Work design will change. Even our benefit space will change as fewer younger people are there and more older people are there. Older people have more medical costs. Simple as that.
What are some of the more innovative or interesting ways you're seeing organizations design kind of benefits, as well as maybe some of the safeguards and controls around these benefits as a result?
And you see many organizations doing a couple of things. One is creating tiered leave policies, so much more flexible and tiered leave policies. So the one-size-fits-all approach seems to be disappearing, basically giving organizations more flexibility, allowing people to, for example, take partial paid leave. So it's not whether it's paid leave or unpaid leave. You can have partial paid leave, which is actually quite an interesting concept. But also, if people have been sick, how they come back to the workplace. So there's almost like a phasing in of from being out of the workplace, not to being fully back in the workplace, but doing 1 day in the office, 2 days in the office, then 3 days in the office, then 4 days in the office. But people getting their salary paid throughout because you want them to return, and companies being much more supportive to them. We talked a bit about wellness and prevention. So that is a very key part because stress is a critical issue in the workplace. You can see post-COVID, many organizations have put in employee assistance programs, mental health training, mechanisms to really give more support to employees who may be under pressure. Again, it's a small percentage, but it shows how critical 5% of the work population is. They're still your colleagues. They still need to be supportive, and they are still the person sitting next to you in the workplace, right? You still have to care about them. Remote working, hybrid working, several organizations allow you to work from somewhere else for a couple of weeks. Sometimes it's not more than that because you start getting into sort of tax complications. But that is also something which is very much encouraged, sort of a hybrid working. Post-COVID, many organizations shrunk their footprint of their offices. So actually many of them, if 100% of people wanted to come back to the office, actually there isn't space for them anymore. So it is great that people can work from home. It is great that people have a bit more flexibility in their working. So if their daughter's recital or son's football match or whatever it may be is happening in the morning, they can go and watch that and then they can carry on working after that. So I think there's much more tolerance for these kind of things, much more understanding, but also the technology is there, whether it be your Zoom or WebEx or Teams, to actually enable people to do this. And it was proven during COVID that it works and we can carry on.
So thanks for painting that picture, Richard, because what it shows is that aside from certain isolated cases of employers overstepping, generally the system self-regulates, be it both through the force of law as well as through market forces. And there are certainly some very interesting trends in the years to come that personally I'm very excited to look and I look forward to. And I'd just like to thank you again, Richard, for generously sharing your expertise on our podcast. I'm Tae Hong Yi, and if you have any questions or personal stories to share about your experience taking leave and what you think is an appropriate approach to oversight, do reach out to us. You can find the contact details in the podcast show notes. Links to my articles, the Headstart newsletter, or my LinkedIn profile can all be found there too. This podcast episode is edited by Amiru Karim. Thanks for listening.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening. Do note, all analyses, opinions, recommendations, and other information in this podcast are for general information purposes only and are not intended to be relied upon as financial advice. You should not rely on them in making any decision. Please consult a fully qualified financial advisor or professional expert for independent advice and verification. To the fullest extent permitted by law, SPH Media shall not be liable for any loss arising from the use of or reliance on any analyses, opinions, recommendations, and other information in this podcast. SPH Media accepts no responsibility or liability whatsoever that may result or arise from the products, services, or information of any third parties. All opinions expressed by participants in this podcast are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of SPH Media.